6,000 years ago, in the fertile valley of the River Nile, the beginnings of Egyptian civilization were sown. It was here that man and beast concentrated after a gradual drying up that made much of North Africa uninhabitable. 3,500 years ago, the Egyptian capital was established at Thebes on both the east and west sides of the Nile. At 7 o'clock in the morning, 6 days a week, when the air is cool, these men leave the Oriental Institute headquarters at Luxor, on the eastern bank of ancient Thebes. They will cross the River Nile 400 miles upstream from pharaonic Memphis and modern Cairo, 3,000 miles downstream from the river's source in Uganda. They will go into the hills of western Thebes to work. In a 30-year-old station wagon, the Egyptologists follow a route traveled by Egypt's mightiest rulers. Thutmose I had come this way, and the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, and Thutmose III, and there was Amenophis III, whose twin statues of himself, the Colossi, stand on the edge of the fertile Theban plain. Behind the Colossi, the hills of western Thebes begin. Neither the annual floodwaters of the Nile nor irrigation has ever brought water to this arid landscape. And so here, to protect the dead, the Egyptians located the great necropolises, the royal tombs of ancient Egypt's new kingdom. The Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens, the Valley of the Nobles. Men had been intrigued by the works of Egypt from before the time of the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt 2,500 years ago. Men are just as fascinated today, and will be tomorrow. Some 40 years ago, scholars from the Oriental Institute came to this area to study the history and culture of ancient Egypt. Year after year, their work builds up the understanding of our heritage, which was and is here. This is the tomb of an Egyptian noble, Keroeth, who lived 3,300 years ago.
This piece of delicately modeled bas-relief is part of a much larger scene that comes from a tomb in the Theban necropolis, the tomb of a man named Keroeth, who was the steward of the household of Queen T, the wife of Amenophis III, the mother of Akhenaten. And the inscription up above their heads indicates that they are caused to stand at the foot of the throne in front of the dais, the staircase, as this determinative of the word shows, on which the throne stands in the presence of the king. And before them are actually depicted on the wall King Amenophis III, the goddess Hathor, and Queen T.
Some years ago, the Oriental Institute and the Egyptian government unearthed this tomb. The Institute is now copying its inscriptions and reliefs. Such work is called epigraphy, and it is exacting, requiring the disciplines of the Egyptologist and the photographer and the artist. Scholars never know in advance what will make the world richer, except that there was here an ancient and finely carved tomb of an official named Keraweth, and that no one had accurately recorded his magnificent tomb before. Dr. Charles Nims and Dr. George Hughes sometimes divide their work between the tomb of Keraweth and a much larger site further to the south, where Oriental Institute men have worked for more than 40 years, the mortuary temple of Ramses III. This mortuary temple, called Medinat Habu, was constructed in the 12th century BC, when the world was changing from the Bronze to the Iron Age. Egypt's power from now on would decline. Medinat Habu, then, is one of the last of the great mortuary temples. Here, there is no need for the Egyptologist to dig. Rather, the need is to decipher and copy scenes and inscriptions on the temple walls.
We're trying to make a record that is definitive insofar as it's humanly possible to do it with the limitations of transferring a carved surface onto a piece of paper with ink. And we're trying to do it in facsimile fashion, not just getting the idea or the content, but doing it as precisely as we can, so that insofar as the thing can be put in a book, we have put everything that can be seen. Primary purpose, of course, of recording it all is to not only make available to scholars at the present time, wherever they may be, as faithful a record as can possibly be produced, but by the same token to make it available to people in the future.
During the last 100 years, there's been a great deal of excavation in Egypt, but there has not been enough recording and publication of those things which have been found. And in addition, there's not been enough publication of those things which were known in antiquity, which remained above the surface, like the inscriptions and the relief carvings showing religious ritual and historical events on the walls of the temples and on the walls of the tombs. And our job is to do just this recording, to fill into this gap, and to make available to students all over the world the historical reliefs and the carvings and the texts which should be available to them, and if they're not available, it means they've got to come to Egypt and climb up ladders and look at them themselves.
From Thebes, one may travel south, as did the ancients, against the Nile's current, further into upper or southern Egypt. But this land cannot be seen as it was ever again. The new high dam at Aswan will form a great lake, 300 miles long, which will cover the banks of the Nile and all traces of life and history in Nubia. Built with the aid of Soviet engineers and money, it will bring badly needed power to industrialize modern Egypt and will permit the irrigation of vast areas now desert. In the 4 years before the Nile River in Nubia began to form a lake, the Oriental Institute sent out emergency expeditions. One of the expeditions worked south of Abu Simbel near the Sudanese border under the direction of Egyptologist Dr. Keith Seeley.
This skeleton was from the period of about 3200 BC. As to why the woman had such a lot of jewelry on one arm and only one on the other is to have been her habit in life, that she probably wore her bracelets on one arm and in mass and only one on the other arm, and at the time of her death she probably was buried very much as she had been in life.
Man had lived in a green strip along these shores for thousands of years. His tools, his pottery, his graves were buried, archaeologists knew, in hundreds of known and unknown places. Could any of these things be found and excavated before they were swallowed up by the new lake? And what could they tell?
From the skull, we can see from the suture closure that it is an adult. From the general size and architecture of the skull, it looks quite male, and the brow ridges are heavy, the mastoids are heavy, the occipital area shows good sites of muscle attachment, all of which are male traits. So, taking everything together, we can say here that we have an adult skull, which is a mixture of Mediterranean Caucasoid and Negroid.
It has happened that the pots that we took out of the graves were in a very fragile condition. They were even cracked, but still holding together. But just in the action of lifting them, when they no longer had the support of the earth in which they were resting, as one would take one of them into his hands, they simply would give way and collapse.
An expedition such as this one requires men to do the arduous work of digging, with skilled Egyptian foremen whose families are now in their 4th generation as professional diggers. The expedition requires Egyptologists who know where to look for cemeteries and how to describe and interpret pottery, a photographer, a government official from the Antiquities Department, an anthropologist who can analyze skeletal materials. The expedition requires general assistant archaeologists, some of whom are often students. The architect's surveys and the precise drawings he makes in his room in the houseboat are necessary to the future publication of the expedition's discoveries. Indeed, the details are persistent and seem almost endless. A bronze mirror. It was New Kingdom, more than 3,000 years old. Who was the lady who held the elegant handle? Was she the wife of an Egyptian officer stationed in Nubia? Was she pretty? Was she a nag? On Fridays, when digging stops because it is the Muslim Sunday, Dr. Seeley now and again visits an Egyptian monument near his expedition. In the 13th century BC, the great king Ramses II built an extraordinary temple along the River Nile in Nubia, the Temple of Abu Simbel.
No one can possibly see this great temple without being astonished that it was possible for men so long ago to fashion out of the solid rock these colossal figures, which seem certainly to be portraits of the king. The Abu Simbel temple is one of the most gigantic of all of the monuments ever constructed by the ancient Egyptians. It is 70 feet from the pavement to the top of the facade of the apse, and the statues themselves are about 60 feet high. When the temple was discovered, by Burckhardt about 150 years ago. He didn't know whether these statues of Ramses II were seated or standing because they were almost entirely covered by the sand that had drifted in from the north side. There is a great court, and it consists of statues, standing statues of Ramses II on each side of the corridor running to the rear. On one of the walls in the interior, there is recorded and represented an enormous panoramic scene of his Battle of Kadesh, which took place early in his reign, and which he represented all his life as a great victory, although it narrowly escaped being a tragic defeat for Ramses. It appears to me that Ramses' purpose must have been to impress upon the people of Nubia and the south, up the Nile, how great and powerful a king he was.
The major monuments in Nubia were dismantled and moved to higher ground before the flooding of the Nile. Abu Simbel will have been cut apart, raised 200 feet to the shore of the new lake, where it will again face the rising sun. On up the Nile, across the border into the Sudan, the biblical land of Cush begins. Here, the Oriental Institute placed a second field expedition under the direction of James Knudstadt. The site of this expedition was a pharaonic fortress now called Serra East.
On first sight, you see a massive pile of mud brick, and it sorts itself out into essentially two periods: the brickwork of a Christian occupation and the brickwork of a much more sizable pharaonic occupation. In between, there is some 1,800, 2,000 years of total abandonment and very little evidence of intermediate periods, intermediate occupation. It seems to be a period of just general wind-laid erosion. Most of our effort goes into the architectural clearance, and this involves handling a great deal of pottery, a minimal amount of archaeological finds, and the architectural problem itself. It takes a great deal of survey work, which is my duty here. It's on a slope. The fort, as a result, stands as a kind of wind-cut hulk on this rock above the river, within which a Christian community was built some 800 years ago, seeking refuge from the onslaught of Islam coming from the north. Its complete excavation is necessary in order to complete the scene of Egyptian conquest in Nubia.
The River Nile no longer sustains this green ribbon of life in Nubia. Now its waters spread into a great lake. The islands of the Second Cataract are buried, as are the settlements and cemeteries which shall forever be unexcavated and incommunicative. But before the flooding, a third expedition spent a last winter season at a little-known pharaonic fortress called Dorganati. Egyptologist Dr. Richard Pierce was in charge.
When we came to the site, it was an open question as to date or occupation periods. We began by sounding it in two main areas. The fort falls into three sectors. A western sector, which is probably the living area, where the larger number of people stayed. A central sector, which is something like a small comb, a small mound built up of a series of occupations, and an eastern sector, which we really haven't touched yet. We have a level of intentional fill, of which you presently see only the bottom. Beneath this, we have a level of pressed sand, which has been worked upon by water erosion. Beneath this, a level of intensive burning, and just a very tiny level of floor deposit beneath that, and then this firm floor. The importance of the site to an historian is simply that one doesn't know anything about it or didn't know anything about it, and it was there, and it was in danger of being lost because of the rise of the floodwaters.
The Nubian people had to move north above the dam where the new lake would not come, far from their distinctive homes and palatial courtyards, far from their ancestors buried in the Nubian earth. It had been a way of life for a very long time. There have never been many of us who could say that our ancestors were nourished from the same soil 5,000 and more years ago. Great migrations are never easy or pleasant, no matter how necessary they may be. The gracious Nubian homes no longer echo from their walls the sounds of new generations. Their drawings are washed away forever. North of the dam, above the lake at Komombo, the Nubians have moved into their new homes. They are now in Upper Egypt, as it was called in ancient days. They are Nubians who no longer live in Nubia. Civilizations have disappeared before. The archaeologist remains.